Now, one of the greatest commandments, Jesus said, the greatest commandment in the Bible is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So love God with everything you've got. The second commandment, he said, is to love your neighbor as yourself, but he redefined neighbor to mean everyone, not just Jews in their context, but everyone. And so that same applies for us today. We are called to love everyone. Now, when you think about that, in the context of those people that you already love, that sounds pretty simple. Oh yeah, okay, I can love people. I can love people in my family and friends and mentors, teachers, people who've had an impact on my life. I can love those people. That's pretty easy. I don't have any problem with that. But then what about the person at work who is making your work environment difficult? What about the classmate that makes it hard for you to concentrate in class? What about people who are just plain annoying or rude or downright mean or even worse, have different political views than you? What do we do when people are difficult or being difficult? Well, first of all, we want to remember that sometimes difficult people don't know that they're difficult, right? So it's not that people are always intentionally making your life harder. They might not realize they're doing it. And so one thing that's important for us to do is to make sure that when we're conversing with somebody that we know what their intentions are with what they're saying. Because so often, somebody can come up to us and they can talk and we interpret what they're saying, we also interpret their tone, we also interpret their mannerisms, and we can then fill in the blanks and say, well, I know what they're thinking, I know what they're intending, and then we respond based on our assumptions about what they're intending to do. And what happens then when we're wrong is that we make a situation much worse. And so one thing to keep in mind is that it's not like there's two groups of people in the world. It's not like there's the people we love and then there's the difficult people. Oftentimes the people we love are the difficult people, right? So it could be that some of the difficult people in your lives are family or friends or mentors or teachers. And so it may be that sometimes they're difficult, not all the time. So it gets really complicated. But especially when you're in a relationship with that person, you really want to make sure, okay, am I really understanding here what they're intending to do? Do they realize they're coming across this way? And that could be as simple as saying, if you're not sure, you can say, now let me make sure I understand what you said, and then they might say, no, I didn't say that at all, that's not what I meant. So you can clarify. But what do you do about people who are being just difficult and they know it? Sometimes there are people who are being difficult on purpose. And no doubt, if you haven't come across that, I'm sure you have already at this stage in your lives, but after you graduate too, you're definitely going to come across that even more. Sorry. But when that happens, when that inevitably comes up, what we want to do is we want to realize that sometimes the best response is no response. Sometimes the best response is no response. In other words, you don't have to respond to everybody. You might think you have to, but you don't. You don't have to respond to everyone. You can, whether it be in person or online. If somebody comes up to you and they say that they want to have a conversation, right? But they don't really want to have a conversation. They just want to have an argument, and they want to make a point. And maybe it's online on a social media post where they give something, they put something on there that's controversial, something that they know you disagree with vehemently. Or maybe it's in person, they say it, they're trying to get you wound up because they want an argument or they want to make a point. And so sometimes when you see something like that, online especially, you don't have to respond. You don't have to comment. You can just scroll on by it and go on with your life. In person, it's a little bit more awkward if somebody tells you something and you're just like, and you leave. That's a little more awkward. But what you can do, and what we oftentimes do, is we steer the conversation away. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody brings up a subject and you're like, no good can come from this, And so you steer the conversation away, and maybe they realize it at the time, maybe they don't know what you just did, but you don't have to respond to everything. When we think about how to deal with difficult people, we want to look at the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is a book of wise sayings for basically advice about life. And Proverbs has quite a bit to say about our speech and how we talk to other people. So Proverbs 15:1 says that a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. In other words, first of all, if we respond to somebody who's being difficult, we want to respond with gentleness and grace. That's not always easy. But when somebody comes at us with the combative words and tone and mannerisms, the tension is already there. And then if you respond without thinking, you're going to ramp it up a little bit. And then they will respond, and it keeps going until eventually, kaboom, it blows up. And so instead, we want to try to remain calm, and sometimes that means pausing for just a moment. You don't have to respond right away. You can pause for a couple of seconds, pause, think, center yourself, and then respond in more of a gentle tone to try to keep it down, to try to keep it from ramping up. It's not always possible. We're human, but it's good to do that. And then knowing, again, that we don't always have to respond to people. Proverbs 26, verse 4 says, well, it's a little confusing sometimes because when you look at the Bible, and especially the book of Proverbs, it doesn't always give us a clear universal rule for what to do. So Proverbs 26:4 says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be just like him. Okay, well that's just what I was saying, right? Don't answer a fool. You don't always have to answer somebody who's just looking for an argument. That's great. Now just don't look at verse 5, whatever you do, okay? Don't look at verse 5. It's just going to mess things up. It's going to muddy the waters. I know you're going to do it anyway, so we'll just go ahead and read it. Verse 5 says this, and this is just going to complicate things. Verse 5 says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. Wait a minute. Let me read those. I'll just tell you those are just right next to each other. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will become just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. Come on, God, which is it? See, and this is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is knowing the rules. You know the facts. You know the rules. You know what they are. Wisdom is knowing when they make sense and when they don't. Wisdom is knowing what situations call for what rules and what advice works. So there are some situations where you are best not to respond to anything to somebody who's being difficult. Otherwise, it's kind of like a lot of times people when they say they're wanting to have a conversation and they're really have an argument, it's like they're fishing. And they're wondering if you're going to catch on to the bait. And if you catch on to that and you respond, then they're going to reel you in, and you're going to become involved in this back and forth argument that has no end, and you're going to become just like them, even though you didn't intend to. So sometimes saying nothing is the best response. But in other situations, you need to respond, otherwise they're going to think they're wise in their own eyes. In other words, you want to respond maybe to help put them in their place in our maybe less angelic motives, or in our more, if we want what's best for them, we want them to know, we want them to grow, and say, hey, this isn't right, what you're doing, this attitude you have, this needs to change, but to do so in a gracious way. So, as we think about difficult people, we want to have compassion, and we want to have sympathy for people whenever possible. So, one thing to keep in mind, too, is that we're all broken people. We all have our problems, our issues. And so it may be sometimes that people who are being difficult are not necessarily, it's not personal, even though it seems like it is. So, their words may be very personal, but it might be misplaced anger. It may be that they are actually dealing with something else, and they're taking it out on you. There are some people for whom the only way that they figured out how to deal with life is to be harsh all the time. but it doesn't mean you have to be harsh back. Now, it doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps us to have compassion for them when we realize that they may have something going on we don't know about. Harshness is not usually the wise way to go about things. You wouldn't know it looking in our culture. If you want to know how to deal with difficult people, or I would say if you want to know how to deal with people, period, don't look at the world of national politics, okay? You will not learn anything that will be beneficial to you, especially next year during the presidential race. Just don't pay attention to that as a lesson in how to handle people. Maybe you'll learn what not to do, but oftentimes, not just in politics, they're not, let's not pick on just political figures, but in all of our national discourse, oftentimes what we see modeled for us is that the best thing to do is to win an argument at all costs. And so the more harsh, the more loud, the more intimidating you can be, the better if you can win the argument. But that's not the way of Christ. The way of Christ is not to lose all the time, but the way of Christ is to be gentle, to be merciful in your speech and the way you treat other people, even those who are difficult. I love the Colossians passage. The one on the cover there that has the guy, could be a woman, but they're modeling this shirt here, and it says to clothe yourselves in compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. And it goes on talking about forgiving one another and letting the peace of Christ dwell in our hearts. Because you see, the thing is, if we let the peace of Christ dwell in our hearts, it's not as though we're always going to say the right thing or say it in the right way. It's just in our nature that when we get a button pushed, we react, right? And maybe it's us, maybe it's the other person, but we react, oftentimes without thinking about it. But as much as possible, if we let the peace of Christ dwell in us, then we may be able to have the peace of mind to be able to think for a moment, center ourselves, and to remember God loves this person, and how I talk to them and how I respond matters. So let the peace of Christ dwell in our hearts, that we may respond to them in faith and grace. Amen.